you are supporting a really diverse community, but tell us a little bit about the traveller community.
It's actually a really lovely community to work with, but one we know faces massive prejudice.
How have you had to equip your teams differently as well? Because to support different backgrounds and different communities.
My general needs housing, I have one housing officer to sort of 200 homes. Within the Gypsy Roma Traveller Service, we have one housing officer to 50 homes. It's really important that you've got housing associations that can build hundreds and thousands of homes a year and can do big developments. But those big developments often miss out some of these specialist groups that we work with. We sort of fill in the gaps that they leave behind.
How do we break the stigma, right? What is the answer?
I think...
Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, James. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to this. And as we like to always start, do you mind just by giving us an introduction to yourself, if you don't mind?
I grew up in council housing and was also a council tenant in my own right. So I've got that background in the sector. I've actually been working in the sector for 35 years, which I don't really want anybody to know. Although, like a lot of people, it's sort of more by accident than design. I've got a degree in astrophysics, which I don't use a great deal. I also did a teaching qualification, which qualified me to do youth work. I was involved in youth work, involved in youth homelessness, setting up a youth homelessness organisation, and have worked in all sorts of ways in the sector since then, both as a professional, but also as a politician. So before I was doing this job at Elim, I was the cabinet member for housing in Bristol.
Lovely. And just talk us about the shape and size of Elim and your role as chief executive.
Elim's tiddly, but very complex. So we've only got 473 properties, but we serve a vast, diverse range of different client groups, which creates its own wonderfulness, but also creates more complexity for the organisation, which also, can impact on cost. So we provide supported housing for people in what are called the homeless pathways. So people who either were threatened with homeless or have been homeless. So that's a big proportion of our properties. We're the biggest housing association provider of Gypsy Roma Traveller pitches across most of the Southwest and more recently into South Wales. We provide general needs rented housing. We provide shared ownership housing. We're starting to work with the local authority on specialist temporary accommodation provision. We've got a block of student housing. And more recently, we've moved into the work of people with very complex needs, learning disabilities moving out of hospital. So we've also got some specialist supported housing. So a very rich range of different services within that envelope of less than 900 homes.
Love that. And very diverse, but I know that's what we're going to come on to talk about. But how important was it for you, and it's interesting to hear your background, but how important was it for you to be in an organisation that supports diversity in the groups of people that you support in your housing? How important was that for you as a chief executive?
I like to be a little bit left field and, involved in things that, other people might shy away from. And interestingly, we've got a pipeline of 200 additional homes, some of it through development, some of it through contracts. Not a single one of those is in competition with another housing association.
Right.
So I quite like being an organisation that's quite niche, that's quite agile, that fills some of the gaps that's left behind between those other organisations. It's really important that you've got housing associations that can build hundreds and thousands of homes a year and can do big developments. But those big developments often miss out some of these specialist groups that we work with. So I think we play a really important complementary role to those larger associations in sort of filling the gaps that they leave behind in that sort of more sort of scaled provision.
Yeah, and I know we talked about this offline, but one of the communities you support's the traveller community, like you mentioned in your introduction. But can you tell us a little bit more about the community and the work you're doing to support them? Because I think, that's something that I've not actually spoken about on the podcast before, which is really interesting. But as you've said, you are supporting a really diverse community. But tell us a little bit about the traveller community, if you don't mind.
Well, of course, the first thing to say is there isn't one traveller community. there's a number of different communities in there, and there are also, it's a community with very strong family ties as well, and very, very strong sort of cultural identity. So within our provision, we've got people from the Roma community, we've got Irish travellers, we've got New Age travellers. I think we might even have some Scottish travellers as well. So you've got this whole range of people from different traditions that sort of lumped together in some ways. Some of our sites are just one community. In fact, we've got one site in Devon on National Trust land where it's actually stipulated that it's just one family. So it's a sort of extended family living within that site as a community, which is something is very difficult for people to do in traditional general needs housing, to keep families together. So that's part of what we do. On some of our larger sites, we've got a mix of all of those traditions. And, on the whole, I'd say that people are very proud of their heritage and their tradition, and are quite happy to talk to you about that tradition and the things that are special around it. They've very strong relationships with animals, for example, whether that's dogs or horses. It's actually a really lovely community to work with, but one we know faces massive prejudice, and you can see that in terms of educational outcome, health outcomes, employment outcomes, whole range of things. But, you can see it viscerally whenever you propose to build a new site. You get a sort of torrent of abuse below the line in the local media, or in letters into, planning committees, basically saying we don't want people like that round here. That sort of racism is not accepted in any other community anymore, but still seems to be considered reasonable or okay in terms of the traveller community. We're about actually to go into planning for a new site in Bristol, and we're working very closely with a number of support agencies and the police to make sure that we're able to manage some of the more difficult elements of the response that we might get from some people.
Never really thought of it that way as well, especially the diversity within the travel community and the different backgrounds. But I also wondered as well, like, how have you had to equip your teams differently as well? Because, like, to support different backgrounds and different communities, because I presume with that prejudice that exists, that puts your staff in a difficult position as well. But how have you had to kind of equip them with the right skills to deal with the controversy?
It takes a lot of time and effort to build trust with a community which has been so ostracized and discriminated against. So my colleagues who work directly in that role have to spend quite a lot of time building that trust, building those relationships, probably much more than you would in general needs housing. So my general needs housing, I have one housing officer to sort of 200 homes. Within the Gypsy Roma Traveller Service, we have one housing officer to 50 homes, whereas a housing officer might visit a site once a month or even once a quarter if it's quite a quiet one. We would be visiting all of our sites every week and working with people to build up those relationships. Also, as with any group of people, you have to be really clear about what the ground rules are, what the tenancy rules are, and you have to be absolutely fair in the way that those are applied. You have to, that consistency is really important. I know it is in general housing as well, but I think particularly with this community who've been treated so unfairly, you have to demonstrate that you're treating them fair. It's really helpful to have people. We employ people who particularly want to work with those communities rather than it's, tagged on to a housing officer's role. And obviously it's, we're really keen to keep people in those roles for a period of time. If you keep chopping and changing who's providing the service, then that can become very difficult in terms of that relationship element.
Yeah, no, of course. And I know that there's going to be some real successes that you've seen, and I want to talk about them. But what have been some of the challenges that you've found supporting some of the more marginalised communities?
Well, I think it comes back to that issue of trust. If you've got a long history of being marginalised, you have to remember. I know it's a while ago now, but it used to be legal in this country to murder somebody who was considered a gypsy if you found them. It's all about building trust. I think that's true of all. We work with a lot of people who've come through the homeless route, people who've come to this country as refugees, people who've been failed by the system in many ways. And fundamental to everything we do is about building trust with people who've often been failed time and time again by authority, and will be seen as another type of authority that they're dealing with. So that working with people so that they do trust that you are there trying to do the right thing and trying to be supportive is critical, whether it's with the Gypsy Roma traveller community, whether it's with some of our general needs tenants or with our supported housing customers.
And how do you make sure that process is equitable? Because, just trying to think pragmatically about this is like, how does the housing need work for a travelling community, for example? I mean, is it the same way as it would be for general needs, or does it go through a different process?
No, I mean, all the people are allocated by local authorities, and people go onto their list. If you've got nowhere to park your vehicle, you are technically homeless. So we could fill our sites many times over, because especially with recent legislation, it's very difficult for people from those communities to be homed in the sense that they've got somewhere that they can permanently park their vehicles to live. That process is managed by the local authority, although we are involved in and consulted sometimes on, how do we approach particular sites, and, how do we prioritise particular individuals. But that's very much about working with the councils who have got the legal duty around homelessness.
Yeah, and is there any other challenges that come up around working with marginalised communities? I mean, one thing you've mentioned there, which has just instantly got me to the point, is that the cost must be much higher in terms of being able to deal with it. But how do you deal with that, and how do you manage to continue to drive for a better service to these communities whilst the rising costs, and like you've said, a housing officer per 50 households rather than one for 200, like that's straight away a cost problem that you're going to deal with?
So our services are commissioned through local authorities. I mean, we've got a whole mixture of different, we've got sites that we own, sites that we lease, and sites that we manage under an agreement with local authority. But we are commissioned in delivery of those services. But obviously, we're also collecting rent from those people. But we do feel that we have to be an advocate as well. So, with some local authorities, we've had to talk about the quality of the sites. Sometimes they've had very low investment. You can imagine with all the pressures on local government, and also the political attitudes that exist towards the travelling community, that sometimes there hasn't been the investment over the years into their sites. And we try and make sure that if we're taking on, say, management of a site from a local authority, as we're in negotiations with a few more as we're looking to extend the service, they've got to bring the sites up to a good standard before we do that. I mean, a lot of people won't know what a site is, James. So it's worth saying that what you have in a pitch is a pitch is fenced off and defined. It's not just a caravan in a field. And on that pitch, you'll have enough concrete basically to park 2 vehicles and to connect them there'll be connections to electricity and water supplies. And then there'll be an accommodation block, which is usually a kitchen, diner, a toilet and a shower. Not live in, because people live on their vehicles or in park homes. It looks like there's a large shed with a lot of parking around it, which in many senses it sort of is, except that shed has got a kitchen in it and it's got bathroom facilities and the. So we need to make sure that those facilities are in good condition. I mean, we're doing some work with Mid Devon Council. I think it's the first example of a council that's actually included traveller pitches as part of a Section 106 agreement. So it's a planning requirement on the developer to actually provide 5 pitches for us, which is, I think, a fantastic precedent.
Yeah, amazing.
But the developer just wanted to provide basically sheds. So although they have to provide the facility to us for £1, basically, for the 5 pitches, it's going to cost us a lot more than that, because we're saying they have to be properly insulated, and that's a higher standard than the planning requirement, so we're paying extra for that. There have to be solar panels on the roof, and they have to be of good quality. And so that's what we feel, that those things need to be incorporated in those developments. And some of the sites around the country are in quite a parlous state. And with other housing associations, I think you've had Boris on this from Rooftop on this podcast in the past. We published a good practice guide, which was aimed at local authorities and other housing associations, saying how sites can be designed and laid out to make sure that you're actually providing a really good quality of home for people, because it is their home.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's got me thinking about garage sites that aren't used, derelict sites that like we could be using way more of the land available to us in some of these local authorities where we're not doing housing development, but it feels like prime land where we could create great sites for travelling communities. But do you see that this is something that will become, more common in housing associations taking this on board? Or do you think you're going to have specialist RPs, housing associations, that deliver these services?
I think on the whole, the reason that we've expanded across most of the Southwest, and as I say now into Wales, is because most associations don't want to do this. Okay. It's for whatever reason, but that means that we can have a critical mass of service, which means we have a specialist team. And I think that's probably, rather than it being tagged on to the edge of a housing officer's job, or something that's sort of in the corner of an organisation that doesn't really want to do it, we do really want to do it. We really enjoy and value working with those communities, and so I think it's probably better if you've got a network of associations around the country delivering these services, rather than everybody trying to do a bit of it and probably not always doing it very well. The other point you raised, which is a really interesting one, is about, where are these sites located? Unfortunately, very often we find that a site is sort of somewhere jammed between a railway line, a motorway, and a waste transfer station. And we do want to bring them back into those sites back into the mainstream, so that people have got access to schools and education and health services and shops and all the other things that the rest of us would take for granted, not stuck on the edge of an industrial estate where there are no facilities, because in terms of that planning opposition, that's the easiest thing to do. And I'm really excited about this. Well, I'm really excited about the site in Mid Devon, which is on a residential estate and next door to a new school that's being built. I think that's definitely the way to go. And in Bristol, the one we're going into planning on soon is right in the middle of a residential area with all the facilities that you would expect in a residential area. That provides much better opportunities for those communities than sticking them as far away as you possibly can from human habitation.
Yeah, that's what I was going to make the point on, because what you did say is that like health outcomes aren't as great, employment outcomes aren't as great, education outcomes aren't as great. Have you seen evidence so far in the services that you provide that you are increasing those opportunities and you are increasing the outcomes for those populations in terms of giving them safety, security, a home, etc., with the right facilities?
That's definitely what we're trying to do. I talked to one woman on a site recently who was proud as punch. One of her sons has gone to university, the other one's at college, and I think people need to step back from their prejudice and realise that actually it's an aspirant community. It's sometimes mentioned, but often forgot, that one of the most successful people in the construction business, Tony Pidgley, who was the chief executive of Barclay Group, grew up as part of a travelling community, and started off with one of those jobs that did drives and built walls and stuff, and became one of the most successful construction companies in London.
How do we break the stigma, right? So, I'm just thinking to myself, before I did this podcast, I'd never thought of this as an issue. I'd never thought of this as a problem people would be trying to solve in the marketplace. And then I came across Elim and looked up and did some research before the podcast. How do we break the stigma about travelling communities? How do we absolutely... because it is something that's inherent and systemic in society at the moment, that there's a prejudice towards those communities. But how do we start to fix that, do you think? What is the answer?
I think, we have to tell the positive stories, and we have to change. There's no point quoting statistics. People just switch off. It's about changing narratives, and that is about success stories and also integration, so that people are seen within communities and are seen as being as much a valuable member of a community as anybody else is. And there are probably quite a lot of people from that tradition who live in bricks and mortar that people don't even know have that heritage, because they don't want to attract discrimination or insult or anything towards themselves. But there are thousands of tens of thousands of people from that heritage just living in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, doing ordinary jobs, and raising their kids and supporting their families and all the rest of it.
Food for thought, definitely. And one thing that we talked about offline, which I'm interested in your opinion, is there's a lot of pressure at the moment on smaller organisations to merge and be absorbed by larger RPs. What's your view on that, and what do you see the role of smaller RPs in the future being? What do you think is going to be the purpose of smaller housing associations?
Well, I mean, smaller housing associations are a very mixed and merry bunch, and some are really good and some are bad and some are sort of somewhere in between. There's not I'm not a small is good, big is bad person, but you do tend to find that customer satisfaction in smaller associations is higher. You also tend to find that there's a lot more specialisation in smaller associations. So there's a lot of skill around working with particular communities. That might be refugees, that might be veterans, that might be Gypsy Rome Traveller, might be homeless, it might be a whole range of different groups. And I think there needs to be space for those organisations to work alongside the larger ones. The larger ones obviously have got much stronger balance sheets. They've got much bigger borrowing capacity. They've got much more capacity generally in terms of human resource. And what I would like to see is much more collaboration between the smaller and larger associations, not some sort of weird standoff. There was a time, of course, when a generalist association could take over a specialist association and have that as its specialist arm, but with as a separate company with a separate governance structure. But what you've found in more recent years is that the large associations, for all sorts of good administrative reasons, have collapsed their group structures and then absorbed those specialisms, and sometimes got rid of the specialisms because they do add cost and they reduce value for money. So maybe the best answer is finding better collaborative models rather than the mergers and takeovers. But as you said, the times are really tough. Finances are really difficult. And in some instances, a merge, well, they're takeovers, aren't they? When a bigger one takes on the small one, are necessary for the survival of a service. So I don't think there are any options that are off the table, but what we don't want to lose is the richness and diversity of what the sector does.
Of course, and having just listened for 25, 30 minutes to your story, I think it shows, doesn't it, that specialism is important, because you can forget about certain marginalised communities based on being a bigger organisation at times. It's not your focus, and I think because you are so in it and focused on it, that it makes you want to drive for better results and outcomes for those communities. And I think that's really, really special. As we wrap up, Paul, what I wanted to understand from you is, what's the future look like for Elim, and what are you hopeful for, and what do you want to solve within your career still? I
mean, in terms of Elim, I think, we've got, it's one of those things where you've got difficulties and excitements at the same time. We're going through a very sort of extensive restructure where we are consolidating our geography. So at the moment, I'm based down in Bristol, but I've got properties in Birmingham. I've got properties in South Wales. So I'm looking at, hopefully passing those to more local associations, or if not, selling some of those properties. I've got some properties that I really can't afford to keep because of the costs of them. At the same time, as an organisation, we're growing quite extensively. We're doing a lot of work at the moment with the NHS around providing specialist accommodation for people with complex needs and learning disabilities, where we're really making a huge difference to people's lives. We're really keen to increase the amount of work we do around homelessness prevention. We're really keen. Obviously, we talked a lot about the Gypsy Roma traveller offer of extending that, and that's one service where we will extend our geography because of that critical mass, as well as providing more facilities within our existing geography. So that's all very exciting. But we have got the loan covenants and inflation and still high interest rates and increases in staffing costs through the national insurance changes that we've got to grapple with. Obviously, quite rightly, there's a big focus on building safety within our existing properties, and so that also puts pressures on the organisation. But absolutely right that as a sector that we're dealing with those issues. The first thing is that people should be safe in our homes and in the communities that we serve. So there's a lot of moving parts at the moment, but actually that's what excites me about an organisation. I think I've worked for large organisations, and it's easy to feel like you're a cog in the wheel, and that you spend a lot of time with admin and writing reports and filling in forms, whereas in a smaller association like Elim, we still have to write reports and fill in forms, but I think we're much more agile and much less bureaucratic than some of the larger organisations. So I think there's a very exciting future for us, but there's always that feeling we've got to get through the next couple of years. We've got to see through that asset restructuring. We've got to see through that asset reinvestment, as well as dealing with growth. And I think we're quite lucky that our business model, our growth model, is as much on management agreements and arrangements which don't soak up capital, as well as new developments. And some of our new developments are 100% funded, which is also quite unusual in the sector, that we get schemes that the NHS are completely funding. We've got one scheme at the moment which is completely funded, is the only project at the moment that's joint funded by the NHS and Homes England. So I feel that even though we're really small, we're quite mighty.
What a great way to finish. I mean, I love that finish. It sounds like, Elim is on a mission to change perception of communities, which I love. I love the fact that you're investing into marginalised communities. I love that, you are small and mighty, but I think that, that comes from a leader that's really passionate about making a difference in the sectors and the areas of the sector that you work in. So what a great insight today. Appreciate you taking the time out to speak to us, and thanks for coming on The Hip, Paul.
And thanks for giving me the platform. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Hip. If you'd like to hear more from us, please be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast platform. We are also running a 30-minute clinic free of charge to any clients that want to recruit in a more inclusive way. For more information, please reach out to us on our website, andersonjames.com.